On most of these articulated flies, your back hook is going to be smaller. It does not mean it's always lighter. You can see with these two hooks, usually when you go up in size, your wire diameter goes up too. If you want to change how a fly swims, especially in still water or salt water, you can mess around with wire diameters on your back hook. Like, I do a lot of lake fishing for pike, and if I put a heavy hook in back, it actually makes these flies kick when I pause, because there's more weight behind and it actually pushes that front hook out of the way. Tonight we want most of this weight in the front, so it gives it kind of a jigging action, more of a straight retrieve but up and down. So we're going to use just a standard recipe of one size smaller in the back than the front hook. So with that said, I'm going to throw this guy in the vise here. Oh, this is a Gamakatsu B10S, which is kind of a general purpose stinger hook. And the stinger is in reference to the direction of the point. See how this point goes up instead of just straight out? What that actually does, and if I can get it to do it, when you set the hook, your hook actually dips down. So if you have a straight point, it's kind of pointing out of the way. These stingers, essentially, you're supposed to get a better hookup rate with them. I would agree with the fact that you do. And they tend not to hang up as much just because they are pointed up. So we're going to start our thread, and if you guys remember the first fly we did, the zonker pattern, this is basically just a fancier version of that. It's just your standard zonker strip top wing with a fancier body and a little bit of extra tail material. And one thing when you guys get going on this, most of you, I believe, we put some gel spun thread on the table. If you try to snip it, it's not really going to work very well. So if you open your scissors, grab the thread and push, it's going to cut a lot easier. But we're going to go right back to where the bend starts, and right on top we're going to take a clump of yellow marabou and a clump of brown marabou. We're going to use marabou 3 times on this fly, and we are going to use these exact same feathers. This is why I like extra select marabou, because for tail materials, I'm just going to come down here to where the stem is really thick and it's pretty much useless as far as wrapping around a hook, and I'm going to pull this material off the stem and save the tip for what we do later on. So I'm going to take, actually I'm going to take my brown first. And one thing that you can do, when I pulled this off of the string it was on, a lot of these kind of look crummy, and if you just mess with it a little bit, especially if you're at home and you have a metal brush, you can brush these out and really save a lot of this marabou that looks not premium. We've kind of already brushed a lot of these out, so I'm going to get rid of anything down here at the bottom that has white, just because that part tends to not be very good. But for this back part, I'm going to take, I'm going to call that about a hook shank worth of material right on the side. I'm just going to pull it off and then flip it around so all the tips are facing backwards. And again, just like in most of our flies, this part of the tail is going to be about a hook shank in length. I'm going to set that right on the shank, wrap that in with 3 wraps, let it sit there, and I'm going to do the same thing with a yellow. I'm going to put the yellow on top. And again, I'm going to pull, I don't know, it's roughly an inch off the side here. I'm going to make sure that these fibers, like the pheasant tail we did last week, make sure they're perpendicular to the stem so all the tips are pretty much lined up. Pull straight down and it comes off, and you can see there's some curly bits there. I'm going to pinch that, measure out about the same length, and right on top of that brown I'm going to tie in this yellow. And now, instead of creating a big giant bump by cutting all these butts off, I'm going to come in and try not to tie down any of my tail material. This marabou is fighting me today.
Like you have glue on your fingers.
And I'm just going to kind of pinch and do some loose wraps and let these things roll around the hook and move up to just before we get to the eye, about an eye length back. I want to leave room for tying my zonker down. We're going to add some rubber legs. I want to have a good base, and I don't want to crowd the eye. So once I get to about here, let's make sure I get those in there. I'm going to hold those up. I'm going to cut that off. And it doesn't have to be super pretty right now, because again, we're going to cover all this up, but I do want to bind down most of this material just to make it manageable. So we've got a little marabou tail going on here. I'm now going to take my zonker strip, and you guys have one long piece. This is more than enough to do this one fly. So we're gonna in lieu of cutting two pieces, you always end up wasting. So when I'm at home, I take the entire zonker strip, which is 15 inches worth, and I never cut them. I use as much as I need and then save the rest. So just like in the first video, we are going to take, so all these fibers are going this way. I'm going to take the butt end, and I'm going to cut that little point in there just to add a little bit of movement, make it a little easier for the water to move this. And it doesn't have to be a crazy long taper or a short taper, but just a little point, just to make it easier for the water to move it. And I'm going to measure out so that the leather of this zonker is as long as my marabou. And that's where I want to tie it in. And then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to separate, get my hands wet here, separate this material, these hairs, so I don't tie anything down. The sponge is not wet enough. And I'm going to loose wrap, and I don't know if you guys can see, but I'm not tying this right on top of the hook. It's towards me a little bit, so that when I bring my thread over, it actually pulls that material right to the top. I'm using my thread tension to get this directly on top of the hook. And now that it's on top, I'm going to hold it with my fingers and do a couple good wraps. Fold it back, wrap forward, and then wrap back, just to help lock in my tension so my tail doesn't move. And I'm just going to leave this hanging out the back right here, because eventually we're going to pull it forward and cut it, and then we're going to use the rest of it for the front hook. But for right now, we're going to let all that sit, and we're going to get our body materials going on the shank of the hook here. And we're actually going to use 3 materials to create this body. And it's going to blend a little bit of UV polar chenille, so you get some flash. You get a little bit of shine in there. So I'm going to tie that guy in just by the tip. Again, this should be enough to do the whole fly. I gave you guys a little bit more just to work with. So I'm going to tie that in right where that zonker strip's tied in, or just in front of it. Tie that in, rest this off to the side, I'm then going to take one of these schlappen feathers. I gave you guys a brown and a yellow, and if you look at them, these are pretty identical. If you have one where the fibers are shorter, I would use that on the back hook and use the longer fibers on the front hook, just to, again, kind of build that taper. These are pretty close together, but I'm going to take this feather by the tip. I'm going to pinch this tip. I'm going to preen everything down just to get it out of the way, and I'm going to cut a little triangle on there, an easy place for me to tie in. And I'm going to tie this in directly on top of this UV polar chenille. Wrap that in nice and tight. And now for our third material, I'm going to do the exact same thing with a yellow schlappen feather. And this one has shorter fibers, so I'm actually going to move a little bit further down from the tip, because as you move down, these fibers get longer. If you're really good at saving materials, you can do this whole fly with just 2 feathers and just save the butt piece that you cut off. You got to have the right kind of feather for that, though. It's got to be long enough to do that. But again, I'm going to cut that little wedge in there, tie that right on top of that brown one, hold everything out of the way, make sure you tie it in good and tight, move my thread up to just about where we tied that marabou off. It's about an eye length back from the actual eye of the hook. And I'm going to put a half hitch in just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. And we'll see if I run out of thread here. I'm going to cut it close. So, now that we've got our materials in, this technique, I've seen it called a complex twist. It's not really that complex, but it's a good way of blending multiple colors and materials together while adding durability. So this UV polar chenille, pretty much not going to break. These feathers, you can break them really easy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this polar chenille and these 2 feathers, I'm going to pull them straight down so that they're all in line. Make sure that all these fibers are coming out, and I'm going to hold them towards me, and I'll show you what happens after I twist them together. So when I twist these, you're going to bind down some fibers, so I like to come in, kind of rough these up. But now I have a nice blend of brown, yellow, and UV flash. And in case a fish eats this and one of their teeth kind of nicks this feather, it doesn't matter, because it's wrapped around this core material of UV polar chenille that's wrapped around the hook. So basically, this body's never really going to come apart unless your thread breaks. So at this point, try to wet my fingers again, and I'm going to pull all these fibers backwards, and I'm going to do one wrap in back, and then I'm going to do open spiral wraps forward. If you do touching turns, it's a little too dense, and you're pretty much just wasting materials and making it a really dense body. So I'm going to wrap forward. Let's see, that was about 4 turns pretty much. 2, and it gets kind of bushy and kind of hard to see, but that's why we pull all these fibers back so we can see what we're doing. 3. The hard part here is not stabbing your finger when you're pulling all these materials back. And now right here, I'm going to capture this by pulling up on my feathers and then wiggling my thread through all of it. And what that does is it basically allows this thread to go through and not bind any of these fibers down. So while I'm pulling up, I'm now going to pull down on my thread so I can let go, pull everything back. Again, do some extra wraps here just to make sure nothing goes anywhere. And if I can find my scissors, I'm going to cut this excess material off. And if you wanted to, again, if your feathers are long enough, you can save them and use it on the front one. We gave you an extra set of feathers so you don't have to. I'm going to come back and I'm going to tie it. I'm going to wrap over that tie-in point just to make sure everything's nice and tight. And again, with this gel spun, we like to use it because you can, the only way you're going to break this thread is by nicking the hook point or a sharp spot on your nail. So you can really, with synthetic materials, it's nice because it really binds it down. You just have to make sure you have good tension. So at this point, if you fluff out the body, we're going to part all this material, and I do it by putting my thumb on top and just kind of rolling around. It's going to part this material, or help part it. I'm going to pull all that straight down, fold my zonker strip over, make sure all my hair is going in the right direction here. And I'm going to pinch right where I want to tie it in. And I want to tie in on top of some of this hair, because again, in the zonker video, when you tie over this hair, it helps stand it up and create the illusion of kind of bulk and height. So I'm going to hold that here nice and tight, loose wrap, pull tight, a couple more wraps, trap the feather there, fold back, tie in front, and now we can cut this leather off nice and close to the tie-in point. Get rid of this guy too, he's bugging me. Now preen everything back, and again, when you're doing this, you can see how close my finger comes to that point. You might hit your finger, it happens. Somehow I didn't do it on Monday, which means I'll probably do it here. So I'm going to really tie that zonker in, give it some good wraps, and at this point I'm going to tie in some rubber legs, these little guys. And this is a cool area where you can add an accent color, like if you wanted to do a hot orange or a red. There's all sorts of different rubber legs out there. I like to attach them by wrapping them around my thread and then evening the tips so I know each side is equal, and then basically just bring your thread over the top, set it right on the side right where you want it, maybe do another wrap just to make sure it's there. Then take the ones going forward and wrap it back, bring it around the hook to you, and capture again, and that way you save thread, and with gel spun that can help because it's a little expensive. And I'm just going to make sure that all that's tied in nice and tight. Do a little whip finish here, tighten down, and that's the first hook. It's really not much to it. It's the setup. It's the multiple materials that kind of throw people for a loop. So really, I mean, I guess you could fish this as is, just a single hook fly. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to measure these rubber legs pretty much right to the end of the tail, maybe a little short. And I just want to cut those just so they're not too long. But you are going to use 2 rubber legs per hook. So 2 on the back hook, 2 on the front hook. But because we're folding them over, it's like using 4. So yeah, that's the front hook, or the back hook. Now that we've got the back hook done, I'm going to start my thread, and I'm going to build a little base here, something to stick these eyes to. So I'm going to do the eyes first rather than tie in the second hook, because I'm actually going to use these eyes to help anchor the wire that holds the second hook. It's not necessary, but I don't ever want this fly coming apart unless the wire physically breaks. So to do that, I have to have eyes on. And you can do this without putting the wire over the eye. I like doing this because it just added security. So to tie these eyes in, I'm going to go back roughly 2 eye lengths backwards on the shank to where I'm going to tie these eyes in. And I'm just going to set them on the hook. It doesn't really matter which direction it is, but I'm going to do 4 or 5 wraps, and I'm going to rotate it underneath. And you can see that they're crooked, right? And that's because I've only gone one direction. Now, when I wrap, I'm basically doing X wraps. I'm wrapping one way, and then I'm wrapping the other way. So I'm going like this, and then I'm going to go like this, and that's going to help even them out. They're a little wonky still. So you want them nice and straight, and you can use your fingers to help with that, but we want it nice and perpendicular to the hook shank. And once I get a few good wraps on there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go under the hook shank, over the eye, under the hook shank, over the eye. And I'll do it like this. Like that. And all I'm doing is I'm basically wrapping my thread around those X wraps I did. And when I hold these eyes and pull tight, I'm cinching down on those eyes. These eyes are not going to move now. You can glue them if you want to. If you tie them in really well, you don't really need to glue them because they're never going to move. So once I get these eyes in, I'm going to leave them there, and I'm going to advance my thread back down to the bend. And one thing I'm going to do, if you've noticed with this gel spun, it can, let's see here if I can get it straightened out. See how it kind of spreads out and there's a bunch of different fibers? If I spin my bobbin clockwise, it cords everything up. And because this wire is coated with nylon, by spinning my thread and creating a cord and then doing open spiral wraps up and down this hook shank, I'm basically giving texture to the hook shank, allowing this wire to bite in, so it's never going to go anywhere. So once I get my thread right to where the hook starts to bend, I'm going to take back hook, I'm going to thread my wire through it, and I'm going to even the tips of my wire. And I'm going to take the bead that we gave you. This is just a trout bead. You can use craft store beads, you can use articulation beads. They come in all sorts of different sizes, colors. We're going to use 1 bead. You can use 2 beads, you can use 3 beads. It's all about spacing. Use as many beads as you need to make this fly as long or to get the spacing that you want. They make metal beads. You can use glass beads. These are plastic. I don't think it really makes a huge difference as long as you're happy with the color. But I'm going to take both of these tips and thread that bead. I'm going to pull this bead down so that there's roughly, ow, told you I was going to do it, I just stabbed my thumb, roughly an eye length of gap here, so that this fly can do pretty much whatever it wants on that back, on that loop. And I'm going to lay this on the hook so that that bead touches the hook shank, or the bend of that hook. And I'm going to rest this right on top. I'm going to give it 3 or 4 or 5 loose wraps, enough to hold it where I want it. And hey, it actually worked. So we want this loop vertical. I don't know if you can see that very well, but the loop that comes out of needs to be perpendicular to the hook eye. Otherwise, your back hook's going to be off at an angle if it's not straight on. So to get this loop vertical, by tying it on top of the hook shank, usually it's off to an angle. You can take one of these, and actually I'll do it like this, and I'm going to twist it. And I can turn that loop any direction I want it. So you can really get it set vertical, and you can also adjust where it is on the hook shank, but I'm going to get a good look at it here and make sure it's vertical. Alright, I've got it nice and vertical now. I'm going to pinch it. I'm going to wrap forward, keeping these wires on top of the hook shank. I'm going to wrap right up to the eye. And now I've got a bunch of excess here. Now, you could cut these off and call it good. If you hang up on the bottom or you get a nice fish, because this is pretty slippery, this back hook could just come right off. So there's options here. A lot of people just bend these over and tie them in, and that works great. For added security, because we have dumbbell eyes that are tied in and they're never going to come off, I'm actually going to wrap this wire around that eye. I'm going to capture it on the bottom of that hook shank. Pull it tight. I'm going to do the other one around the eye also, and capture that. And I gave myself a little bit too much wire, so I'm going to have to snip these. But I'm going to wrap that in with good tension, almost all the way down, and then just do some extra wraps. I mean, you can't get these things too tight. You're not going to hurt anything by making it super tight. I don't know where my snips went, so there they are. I would recommend a good pair of diagonal cutters or needle nose with cutters. In a pinch, if you have arrow scissors, and these are mine, Dave, they're not yours. These little notches, if you open these scissors, that's not part of your actual cutting blade. You can catch that wire in that notch and cut it like that without destroying your scissors. If you do it enough, they will become loose. So needle nose are great. But I'm going to snip these off. I'm going to roll this over just so I can get access to it. Pull these up. Again, try not to stab myself. Let's see here. And Just cut enough so you can tie it down and not have them sticking out. When you're dealing with freshly cut wire, you have to be a little careful. It's about one of the few things that will break gel spun. So I'm wrapping with pretty good tension right here, and then when I get to these cut ends, I'm just going to loosely cover them. Because if you pull too hard, you will break your thread. And so now, if you kind of look at this, this back hook is a little higher than the front hook. I'm going to wrap back down the bend of this front hook just to line these up. I think that's pretty good. So I'm going to move my thread back to where the hook shank is level. And if you wanted, you could color this with some permanent marker. You could use yellow thread if you really wanted to. It's going to get pretty well hidden, so I'm not going to worry about it. And I'm going to take, just like the back hook, we're going to do a little bit of marabou. And I'm going to grab the same amount of brown and the same amount of yellow. Set this down here. I like to do this clump of marabou as one and kind of blend them a little bit, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. So you get your two clumps of marabou, and you're going to line up these tips, and while they're in your hand like that, I'm just going to kind of roll them around and just kind of fold them together just to kind of get a good mixture. And I really only want enough marabou to bridge that gap to that second hook. If we go too long, it's going to end up fouling and catching funny, so I want just enough to bridge that gap. And I'm going to, again, no tension on this thread, nice and loose, and then tighten down once you get around all that. Once you got them on top, I like to smash my thumb into this and kind of spread it around the hook shank. You don't need it to be on the bottom, but it helps kind of fill in that void where there's no materials there. Because we're going to have a zonker on top, so I'm not too concerned about the top. I want to get around the side, and you can see I'm not really on that side at all. So this is where you take your time, and I can roll this material over and make sure that it's covering where I want it to cover. And so now I'm going to wrap forward just a little bit to make sure this stuff's not going anywhere. Wrap back. Cut all these butts off. And you can see already that because these eyes are here, our front body is not going to be very long. So you're going to want to be careful not to crowd these eyes. We need to leave room for this head, which is why I left this marabou fairly far back from these eyes. Because we got to tie in our zonker, we've got to tie in rubber legs, we've got to do some more marabou, and then the head. So we just need to be conscious of our proportions in these bigger flies. So now I'm going to take my zonker strip that I have left over. We're not going to cut a point into it because it's in the middle of the body. It doesn't really need to move that much. And again, I just want to have this leather basically cover the gap. So I'm going to set this leather down so it's just about touching the eye of this back hook. And when I get it to where I want, I'm now going to spread all these fibers out so I can tie it down without binding materials. And again, I'm gonna lean it towards me a little bit, so when I do a tight wrap here, it's gonna pull it all the way to the top. Fold this back, a couple wraps in front. Get this guy out of the way. And we're gonna do the exact same body that we did on the back hook. We're going to tie in our UV polar chenille right on the side. We're going to take our brown schlappen. Spread these out a little bit. We're going to prepare that. We're going to tie that in at the tip, just like the back fly or the back hook. Get this guy out of the way. Again, right on top of that UV polar chenille so that they twist together nice and easy. And now my yellow. Right on top of the brown. Get those in nice and tight, and I'm going to move my thread to, I don't know, about an eye length behind the back of the eye. It's kind of hard to see, but I basically want my head to be about, what is that, a little over a 1/4 inch long. And again, I don't want to crowd anything, so I want to make sure I have enough room. What are you looking for? Oh, yeah. So I want that head. I want enough room on this head so I can get a fairly decent sized head on there. So I want to stop basically where this eye is right here. I want to stop my thread on the back side of those eyes in the same position. So once I get it to where I want it, half hitch it so that it doesn't move and you don't end up crowding the head again. Until I started putting half hitches in to remind myself to stop. You can get kind of carried away with making a body with this. It's easy to do too much. So again, I'm just going to pull all these tight, start twisting. And you can twist, you know, the more you twist, the better the colors blend. But there is a point at where these feathers will break. So it kind of takes a little trial and error to figure out where that point is. And I'm using a bodkin just to kind of try and pick out some of this UV material. It does get matted down there. So again, I'm just going to preen all these fibers back, do a nice tight wrap right to that zonker strip, and you're only going to get probably 3 turns of this material on this front hook. So there's 2. And again, take your time, make sure you're not binding anything down. Get about another half a turn here. And this is where a clamp vise comes in handy. So you can really manhandle these materials and not worry about your vise walking away on you. So again, I'm going to capture this right on top, and by wiggling my thread, it tends not to capture any of these materials I don't want to tie down. I'm going to pull all this stuff out of the way, at least try to. Get some wraps in front. And I'm going to cut my waist. And then obviously I trapped some there. I'm going to pull all these back a little bit just to clean everything up. And just like on the back hook, we're going to separate these top fibers to either side, so we get, you know, a part down the middle. I'm going to pull these all straight down and out of the way so I can fold this zonker strip up and over. If you pull these fibers back, we're going to tie right on top of all this hair. And that's going to help stand our head up a little bit. So I got 3 wraps. I pinch that material to keep it on top, and then I really pull down to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. I'm going to pull that forward, get a couple wraps in front, one more just to make sure. We're going to cut this material off. And then bind down any of this leather from the rabbit that is loose. And I'm kind of crowding this aisle, or getting a little close, so I'm going to wrap backwards and give myself a little bit more room to work with. And it's not much, it's a couple thread wraps back, but that will make a difference. So I'm going to tie in some rubber legs now, just like we did on the back hook. And again, there's a bunch of different ways to tie in rubber legs. This is my preferred method because I can place them wherever I want with tension, and I find it's just a little easier for me to do it this way. If you have a preferred method, go with it. So there's my rubber legs. At this point in time, I like to use, I've got a lot of these hair clips. They're great for holding materials out of the way, especially rubber legs, because they just want to fall down and get in the way. So I'm going to pull this material back, get a hair clip in there, kind of hold that out of the way and hopefully keep myself from stabbing myself. So now here's what I consider the trickiest part. We are going to take what's left of our marabou feathers and we're going to wrap them around the hook shank 1, maybe 2 times. You don't need much. Again, like the body, it's easy to overdo this. And the nice thing is with nice marabou like this, you can see how thick this stem is, and then it gets really thin. We're really only using this top portion. See how it kind of stops bending right there? I don't need anything below that. So I'm actually going to come up and I'm going to preen all of these fibers off, because you'll see here in a minute this thing gets pretty unruly here, and it's a little hard to manage. So if you kind of make it look like a palm tree, it's a little easier to manage. I'm going to do that with the yellow and the brown. Again, if you take these and pull down on the tip, you can see where it stops bending, and that's, you're basically not going to wrap these stems any further than that, so you can get rid of all this. And I'm going to tie in my yellow first, and we're going to tie it in by the tip. So you're going to grab just the tip, and you got to be fairly gentle with these, they will break. I'm going to separate that tip, and just like the marabou, I'm going to leave myself a little bit more, or I should say just like the schlappen, leave myself a little bit more to tie in. Again, because this is a fragile material. Tie that one in. I'm going to tie my brown in the same way. Separate that. Tie this guy in. And basically, again, I'm going to do 2 wraps tops of this marabou, because if you do too much, it's going to overwhelm the fly, and you're not going to really be able to see anything else that we did on it, and it's going to lose the effect. So I'm going to take these two feathers, and just like before, I'm going to try to preen these back. And I'm going to do, that's 1 turn, 2 turns, and now that I'm straight up and down again, take my thread and again kind of wiggle it back and forth. And take your time here. If you think you're binding anything down, just obviously don't let go of the feather, but try and keep a hold of it until you have tension on your thread, and then you can let go. Pull everything back out of the way so you can get some wraps in front, and then I'm going to wrap back over all of these butts we just tied in. Because those stems are so fragile, if you wrap over them, they can't break, and it won't come undone. So now you need to isolate the stems you want to get rid of, and I find if I come in from the back to cut it, I cut less material that I don't want to cut than if I come in from the front where my tips are actually into all this working material. So I'm going to come in, support my tips of my scissors, cut the yellow, maybe cut the brown. There we go. And then preen all these back, again, just to make sure. And so basically what I did is when I wrapped those marabous, the marabou feathers, I kept it on top of the zonker strip I tied in. I gave it a nice base. And my thread is still on top of that zonker. So now that we've got those tied in, we're ready for the head and the last step. I found that by leaving an appropriate amount of space back here, I can get at least 2 wraps of our head behind the eyes, and then 2 to 3 in front. And so to tie these in, if you just try to tie that in, it's probably going to slide out. It's really hard to bind down this much material. So I'm going to take each one of these and I'm going to pinch it. I'm going to take my other hand and I'm going to pull all of this chenille material off of the tip. And you've got 2 cords there. So if you let go, they'll start to unwind. So keep pinching it and tie in just those cords. And try to get back on top of that zonker strip. And if you start off of it, that's fine. Just work your way back so that you don't have a gap there in between the marabou and your head. And again, I'm going to do the same thing on the yellow. Pinch, pull all this fluff out, and tie it in right behind those eyes. Get some good wraps, make sure it doesn't come out. Move your thread in front of your lead eyes. And again, I like to do a little half hitch just to make sure it's not going anywhere. And just like on the body, get rid of this thing. Let's see here. I need water. If you get the marabou wet, it will cooperate more. And just like the body, I'm going to take both of these and I'm going to twist them together. And I'm really going to twist these. So that's about halfway twisted. You can still tell that there's a brown and a yellow, but if I continue to twist, these get nice and tight together and you get this nice brown and yellow mixture. So I'm going to start wrapping, and just like with everything else that we've wrapped, I'm going to pull these fibers back so that hopefully it's just the core against the hook shank. I'm going to wrap one. I try to get 2, sometimes 3 wraps of head material behind the eyes. And I don't think I'm going to get 3, so I'm going to cross over these eyes on top of the hook shank, and I'm going to go in front now, and just sometimes it'll untwist depending on which way you twisted it. I'm going to try to get 2 wraps in front. And you can really manhandle this stuff. It's not going to break. I'm actually pulling on it right now to make sure everything's nice and tight. And so when I get straight up and down, wiggle my thread through 2 times. Pull up on your chenille, down on your thread, really lock it in. Try to get a couple wraps in front. Before you cut anything off. And once you get a couple wraps in front of it, you can come in with your scissors. Whack those off. And then try to move all this excess material out of the way. And take your time finishing the head of this. Because if you tie down a bunch of synthetics, you're not going to get the best pressure and it may come undone unless you super glue it. But it's hard not to stab your finger here, so got to be a little careful. And then essentially, try to get these guys out of it. Once you get a whip finish in, get it nice and tight. My light's moving. You can cut your thread. And then I always go in with a bodkin because inevitably we're using enough bushy materials here that you're going to trap some down. But that's it. That's the fly.